Rami, you can start.
Hello, my name is Abhirami, young designer and exhibition design graduate from NID Ahmedabad and co-curator of Lines of Sight, NID's annual design show 2021. The 2021 Convocation Week talk series Points of View, in conjunction with NID's annual design show, is a forum for dialogue between young designers, practicing professionals, and academic leaders. Each 90-minute session will have guest speakers from the design industry, student speakers, roundtable discussions, and audience Q&A. The Lines of Sight 2021 exhibition documents and exhibits the pluralities in our unique ways of seeing as design students, young practitioners, and as a design institution. As remote learners and teachers, we have spent most of the past year as nearsighted beings living in teleworlds. The act of seeing becomes more significant than ever. It has to be thought of anew to develop active seeing, active listening, thoughtful reflection, and careful action. As designers, we are learning to see again by slowing down our processes, taking time to reflect, and showing care in our efforts. Exhibiting over 200 classroom and graduating projects virtually and as a pop-up exhibition on the NID Ahmedabad campus, Lines of Sight probes into themes of inclusivity, speculation, technology, sustainability, narratives and archives contextual to the UN SDGs, education, health and well-being, and culture studies. The curatorial theme for today at Points of View follows HindSight, the site for reflecting on histories, archives, craft, and holistic ideas of narratives. Now, we welcome our panelists for today. Sarita Sundar, communication design alumnus from NID and founder of HANU. Our faculty interlocutor, Rishi Singhal, discipline lead and faculty of photography design at NID Gandhinagar. Student presenters Arjunvir and Rashi Sharma, Jyotsna Ramesh, Kasturi, Sharan Adka, and Sreelakshmi M. I also welcome my fellow Lines of Sight curators, Tanishka Kachru, Faculty of Exhibition Design, Sucharita Benewal, Faculty of Textile Design, Amog, Amrita, Geetika, and Ritika. Here is the format of events planned for today. First, we will have our guest speaker and designer, Sarita Sundar, speak about her experience and observations from working in design and heritage interpretation. She will also share her perspectives on HindSight and design practice. Following that, we will have brief presentations by the student speakers whose work falls under a common umbrella theme and deals with history and narratives. We will then have a 20-minute long roundtable discussion with all panelists. To everyone watching live, please note down your questions and remarks in the chat and comment sections. Our speakers will be answering them live in the Q&A and chat box throughout the duration of the session. The theme for today's session is HindSight, which is defined as an understanding of a situation or event after it has happened or developed. The theme HindSight is interpreted as a space for retrospective research and storytelling that is guided by one's experiences, culture and identity, and design practice. The main inquiries guiding this curatorial track are: what are the ways in which we look to the past to inform the present and build for the future? How can we develop our ability to see what is in the distance clearly, to resist the condition of nearsightedness imposed by our situation? Sarita Sundar holds a postgraduate degree in visual communications from NID Ahmedabad and a Master of Arts in Museum Studies from the University of Leicester in the UK. Sarita's practice and research spans heritage studies, popular and visual culture, and design theory. At HANU, her research interpretation and design consultancy, she combines over 30 years of working with brand strategy and design solutions with her academic training in museum studies. Over the years, she has engaged in critical inquiries into how culture engages with the visual, ranging from research into Indian vernacular typography to studies of Indian intangible culture in performance practices. With this, I invite Sarita to take over. Sarita, the floor is now yours.
Thanks a lot, Abhirami, and thank you to all of you for inviting me to participate in this forum. It's always sort of so wonderful to be back in one's alma mater, even if virtually. The collection of projects that have been featured through the week have been so incredibly extraordinary. So I must congratulate both the students as well as the curatorial team for this effort. I'd like to share my screen now. Do let me know if there is a problem. Is that good?
Yes.
You can see it. Okay. Thanks a lot. So I left high school with plans of doing art or art history. However, as a result of various events that I'm not altogether sure of how it sort of turned out to be, I did rather well in my 12th board math paper. And my father, who was a political scientist and from the humanities sort of field, was super excited that finally there's someone in our family who can handle some numbers, and insisted that I follow a career in math. And so it was that when I did not get admission into the one art school that I applied to, I joined a mathematics honors course at St. Stephen's in Delhi. Now, I was completely out of my depth in this college level mathematics and spent most of the year playing basketball as part of a rather fledgling women's team. But here's where the unfortunate thing happened that caused a sort of turn of events. We were a terrible team. And when I say that we were bad, we lost all our matches and we lost them really badly. Suffice to say that if our team was actually more successful that year, I may well have stayed on to study math. But instead, I jumped at the chance when I did get admission into this obscure course called design at a rather obscure institute called NID. This was 1984. So design was obscure. But hey, I thought it wasn't art or art history, but at least it wasn't math. We've all had a number of events in our life that have been any one of these. It is, in a sense, hindsight, the sort of theme for today's session, that allows us the ability to use our intuition and to build on serendipity, to take that chance, to recognize the epiphany, to make the unfortunate into the fortunate. Apologies for paraphrasing the title, but don't we all sometimes feel our lives resemble some sort of an absurdist black comedy drama in the lines of Lemony Snicket's book by the same name, or rather similar name? The projects that the students will showcase today feature ideas on memory, on the object, and the materiality in archives, on memory and loss. Today, I'm trying to sort of share with you, as part of HindSight, a few events and projects that have had some meaning to me over the course of my 30-odd years. I've tried to collate this and curate it in a way that I hope will resonate with all of you and provoke thought on the students' projects that will follow. After NID, I worked with possibly the first graphic design studio of significance in India at the time, around 1992 or so. That's Ray and Keshwan Design. And then later in 2005, I set up Trapeze along with Ram Sinham and a team of extremely talented designers, Aparna Ranjan, Georgie Paul, Shreyas Krishnan, Aditi Dilip, to just name a few of them. While working with Sujata and Ray and Keshwan taught me the value of the axiom, God is in the details, within this very sort of modernist graphic design idiom, which we were taught at NID. At Trapeze, we worked at some very, very exciting multidisciplinary projects, while also designing at least, I think, 30 or so traditional and not so traditional brand identities. But it was the exhibition projects that I believe made our studio at the time iconic. We did an exhibition on the herbal Malabar knowledge, which was at NCBS in 2008. We kind of dropped down 5 fabric ficus trees that you could walk through in the same manner that you can actually an actual banyan tree, the image that you're seeing. We did exhibitions on wall paints, Asian paints. We brought together collective memories of the floods in Mumbai. We enshrined elephants on stone. And in some projects, at least, I believe we pushed the boundaries of the modernist idiom of less is more. I like to believe that we challenged the myth of modernism that we were rather stringently taught at NID to revere. I'll speak about that a bit later. About that time, we'd also sort of started working on a number of archival projects that involve the history of companies, institutions, and yes, the history of something as simple as plants. One of these was a documentation of the delivery of eye health in rural Andhra Pradesh, and it was meant to be put together in the form of a book. As part of the project, I decided to capture the wonder of sight through documenting a shadow puppet performance, or Tolu Bommalata, which is what it's called in Andhra Pradesh, in rural Andhra Pradesh. This event of actually documenting and sort of being there in rural Andhra Pradesh was to be very, very epiphanic for me and made me question the issues and problems that exist in the way in which we communicate in heritage spaces and museums today, but also in the sort of choices that we were making as graphic designers. While documenting the wonder of sight for the project, I felt a sort of a new connection with this gamboling sort of monkey god puppet Hanuman, the star of the show, really. He was the proverbial superhero, changing size. He was impish at one end, he was imperious, he was monumental, he was gentle, he was devoted. There were at least 4 different versions of the puppet during the course of that show. We were there, of course, not just to document the actual shadow puppet, but to document the faces of the people and to sort of capture the wonder of sight. And a lot of these photographs are by Ramu Aravindan, who happened to be my sort of fellow student at NID, but also a colleague later. But in this, I sort of saw in reality what Roland Barthes speaks of the many sort of individual punctums, a sort of a multitude of arrows shooting from the screen onto the eyes of the participant, full of resonance and wonder. I did have a sense at that point that this moment was unique, that this endless new configurations of shadows coming together and the larger horizon of consciousness around it was an event that would never repeat itself in exactly the same way. Really high on that experience, I came back to the studio and wanted some piece of memory, a sort of a takeaway. And so I ordered a Hanuman puppet from the performers. When it actually eventually arrived by post, I was just a bit disappointed. It was in this fresh, crisp leather puppet. It had cuts. That was altogether too shiny and new and leathery. There was nothing wrong with the workmanship, really. It was superb. But it really did not give me a sense of having been there. I wanted the puppet, in a sense, to sort of capture the memory that I had of that time. In order to hold on to a memory, we look for triggers. We look for triggers in objects, we look for triggers in smells. You remember your grandmother's sort of cooking smell sometimes. We then try to sort of capture them and display them in the museums of our mind or in the museum buildings in our nations. We look for things that remind us of who we were or our ancestors. We look for ways to trigger that sense of being there. It is said that what defines an object in the context of heritage is a thing. It's a thing, a lump with a cultural value that can be portable. What came to me by post, I felt, had no value. It was a lump without any value. Eventually, what we do is we seek out what James Joyce calls that sort of whatness, the quality that makes the soul of the commonest thing seem to us radiant. We seek objects that have effect, the ability to induce an emotional reaction. These are the things that, as sort of people in the museum field, will look at to try and capture in a museum setting. I realized then that the qualities of the Hanuman puppet that I saw was not actually portable. It was something that was actually outside the puppet, the shadow maybe, elusive, not mute, kinesthetic, multidimensional shadow. Something that's not indirectly connected to the puppet's material properties. Maybe it was indirectly connected, but not directly connected. The material qualities, which are its translucent leatheriness or the finely cut decorations. Should I then be seeking out the shadow and not the physical objects itself? I realized the need then to understand effective powers of objects in ritual performances and the importance to see how they are displayed in museums. I remember visiting the Met a few years later and seeing sort of masks and headdresses of a Papua New Guinea tribe in the most impressive of halls. The manner in which they were displayed were monumental. The decisions of choice were surely on the basis of aesthetics and monumental value. It was a curator led decision. I believe it had very little to do with the cultural significance of the object or the community's own value for those objects. They were often displayed encased in glass or hung inanimately, dead and rather lifeless. They were, in my mind, lamps with no cultural or emotional value. It got me thinking, really, at that point, about the nature of the object itself, about the value of wear and tear on authenticity, on wabi-sabi, on reproductions and imitation. This one event, I believe, led to my changing the way in which I started viewing projects and also shifted my own work. I embarked then on a study in museum studies to sort of understand this further, and I later set up HANO, a heritage interpretation and design consultancy. I started questioning the supremacy of the visual, of the monumental, of a curator-led aesthetic, or even the way in which communication and graphic designers base their decisions on aesthetics and not always on cultural or community significance of an object or a story. With that, I'd like to share a few projects that I've worked on thereafter. Here is a sort of a project on pastoralists. For those of you who may not know what pastoralists are, I didn't know till I did this project. Pastoralists are basically nomads with animals, like the Changpas in Ladakh or Fakirani Jats in Gujarat. Along with a very talented illustrator, Somesh Kumar, who did these illustrations, we created a series of graphic novellas. Each novella tells the story of a unique problem that a particular pastoral group faces in India. This was part of the sort of Living Lightly exhibition, which was held at the IGNCA in 2016, I think, and won a sort of design award. Each novella really takes one character who was partly imaginarily, partly who we met really through books and films that we researched. We were careful to ensure representation across genders, geographies, religion, and issues that they faced. The title comes from a quote that came from one of the pastoralists who said that he wanted to live in a land or in a place or a world without a roof. Another project that I'd like to sort of briefly talk about was one which I received a grant from the India Foundation for the Arts, which allowed me the opportunity to look at the object systems in a village festival, in my village in Kerala, actually. And it questioned the very nature of materiality, of looking at objects that had no materiality. For instance, so what I'd done was to sort of look at object systems across the festival. So there were objects that created rhythm, objects that created a sense of Adbuddha, objects that talked about cyclicity that is sort of core to a lot of our village festivals. And one of them was objects that acted as time markers. So for instance, a flag going up is a time marker, which is a material object. But on the other hand, the clang of anklets that was told to me by one of the villagers was looked at as an object itself because it marked the beginning of a festival. Another key project that I'd worked on, which is called Back to the Future, is an exhibition at the Godrej Archives that told the story of Godrej through their archives. And we had very, very little space actually physically to work on it. And what happened that this project allowed me to work on many of the project concepts that I felt were critical to exhibition designs, whether in exhibitions or even in archival situations such as books and stuff like that. By that time, sort of, and words like interactivity and participatory were the buzzwords of this new museology. I felt it was the sort of potential to talk back, for the potential of small objects, the potential of individuals, of smaller communities, of the big ideas to talk back that makes it all so exciting. The idea of not using linear, universalized, closed narratives, instead not using fixed records, and sort of in some way trying to sort of undo the traditional curatorial systems and rather celebrate sort of heterogeneity and even irreconcilability, celebrate networks, celebrate hybridization. That was the sort of aim for this exhibition. And in some ways, try and make the spectator a curator for himself, or the visitor can curate his own experience. I'll share a few images with you. Here, what we did was we sort of used the surface that you see to represent the entire Vikroli map. And each of those sort of squares on the ground are actually factories, and you can actually walk on those sort of spaces. And then you can listen to audio recordings, you can go through a whole series of images. You can listen to oral histories of people who were part of the factories and things like that. What it also allowed us to do was to condense a lot of content that was there at the Godrej Archives into a very, very small space. I'm going to have to sort of switch screens right now because there's some problem. But I wonder if any of you can recognize what you're seeing on the screen. And if you can, maybe you could just quickly put it up on the chat box. And I can't see the chat box. But
the answer is elections. Through elections, our entire adult population can choose its representatives to form the government.
So this small sort of object that you see, it had no monumental value. It was a rather drab-looking box, something that anyone would sort of ignore or hesitate to use on a screen, such as in an exhibit like this. But it had a great sort of relevance for it being the first ever ballot box, or first set of ballot boxes that was used in the first ever election in India. And we sort of augmented digital sort of, like this video was playing in a little tablet. So you see this object, you might ignore it, but as you go by, this little video plays, and then you get to see really what the meaning of that object is. And I felt that it was one of the ways, or one of the sort of devices that we used in order to, in some way, allow smaller objects the potential to talk back. And we also had various sort of instances where you could actually look at the journey of an archivist herself, or himself. For instance, you could sort of, look through these sort of panels and turn them around and look at the QR code and understand a little bit more of the archival objects that these wonderful archivists had discovered. But also, not to be overly caught up with the digital, we felt it was important to look at the other sensors, our sort of other senses as well. And what we did was we introduced a perfume that visitors could smell. We created a soap which was from a recipe from about 100 years back, which visitors could take away. In a sense, trying to sort of highlight the fact that the digital that most of us sort of get excited about is really only yet another tool that we use. While at NID, there was always a sense I had felt about the sort of very regimented language that we were taught. And at NID, a few generations of graphic designers, including me, were taught the value of creating extremely clean layouts with dynamic white space, balanced in position so as to aid legibility in the modernist idiom. It was only actually towards the end of my stint at NID in 1984 that I started, 1990, that I started questioning whether these objective layouts were an anachronism against existing vernacular norms that celebrated the particular, the dense, and the layered, which is what you'd see in our streets around us. While I'd have a sense at that time that this was something I'd like to question more deeply, I did not act upon that provocation or intuition, and it took me actually 25 years to actually put thought to paper and write this essay, which was presented at the Typo Day seminar in 2016, Indians Don't Like White Space. If anyone's interested, I'm happy to sort of share the paper with you. Here, one of the things that I also looked at as ways in which, what are the Indian ways of communication, trying to find if there's a connection between Indian ways of communication and the sort of the new ideas that were being, at that point, brought out in the Cranbrook School of Design, which looked at deconstruction theories. And you have sort of images here. And on the left is from a student of mine from Srishti. The one in the middle is a poster by April Greeman, who was at that point, I think in the 90s, along with Catherine McCoy, looking at ideas of deconstruction. And the one on the right is a 16th or 17th century Ayurveda man. And I started sort of seeing, or rather attempting to sort of see a connection between this layering of information, the idea of image and text sort of working together, but more importantly, trying to sort of see whether there is a certain intertextuality that exists between these various elements on a page. Another project that we had initiated at Hano, it was self-initiated, looked at the little-known stories of women in Karnataka history, recognizing that there were many stories that at least I did not know, having studied in the North. This is a project that's still open, looking for collaborators. What we did was we looked at these stories of various women. Very few people outside, I mean, maybe people in Karnataka, some of them knew, but not a lot of them. But, Savitri, who works with me even now at Hano on occasional projects, did a lot of sort of print collateral as part of this project. But I felt it was important to experiment with a new way of sort of converting something like this into a manner that was not traditional. And what we did was to have a workshop, and we participated in the Unbox that was held at that point in Bangalore, and shared these stories with the participants at the workshop. I collaborated with a friend and extremely talented printmaker. Unfortunately, she's got her hair down in the picture that you see, Bess Fremodig. And what we did was we got people and talk to each other. And what it did was it engenders, it provoked a lot of conversation about, you know, somebody's grandmother or aunt, and what were the things that they were doing to either break free of certain restrictions or issues that they faced. And then we had a sort of a short workshop, a sort of print workshop, that was creating these postcards that people could send out as either a Rani Abaka to a Ravani Chellama. So you were sort of sending postcards across history. And there was actually a woman who actually let her hair down. And as you can see on the image on the screen, this was a postcard that was done by Surabhi, who's also a graphic designer, who was a participant. And she And a lot of what it allowed was, the workshop allowed was for a way in which to talk about stories from history, which was not just a sort of top down looking at panels or being fed something that was from a curator point of view, but to participate. And the very act of actually physically drawing and talking allowed for conversations that really, I thought, challenged or at least sort of looked at a different way of looking at history and heritage around it. Nietzsche, I can never pronounce his name right, Friedrich Nietzsche, the French philosopher, tells us to carve time and to introspect, to sort of find time to oneself, to spend time in solitude, to ensure that we don't sort of follow the crowd, to use our intuition. And maybe over the last 1 year or so, we've had an awful lot of time to do that. In fact, in one of the sessions in the last week, I remember listening to a student who talked about being trapped at, in front of his desk, and the loneliness that comes to it, with it. At the same time, there has to be some value in what this Nietzsche says. Have we been able to take advantage of this unfortunate event that we're all in? Have we allowed ourselves in some way to have moments at least of productive introspection while we do tackle the sort of loneliness that has come alongside with this? I'd like to end with this little girl's face, Leela, photographed by Ramu, which to me actually reminds me in the best manner of having been there at the Tolubammalata, under the stars in Andhra, of feeling that rush of feeling for the Hanuman puppet. And I realized that I really didn't need a physical object to sort of trigger that memory. All I had to do was to look at this image in front of me. So thank you, Ramu, for that image and for this photo, and to help me transport back to that memory. Thank you very much. That's all.
Thank you so much, Sarita. It was absolutely
Sorry, go ahead.
It was absolutely inspiring to hear you speak about your work and the way that your work and your experiences paved the way for your practice. Lots of us here are at the crux of similar speculation about where we're headed as designers and as people. HindSight connects the temporality of the past and the future through the reflective nature of the present. Designers question the formation of the archive as a resource, history as a foundation for their inquiry, and introspection and extrospection as a means to examine themselves and their contexts. These projects not only explore narratives about the designer self, but their culture, gender identity, ancestries, and design practice. Here, we now share the student projects featured under HindSight in the LOS exhibition. The KES project by Arjunvir Singh and Rashi Sharma is an attempt at archiving histories and memories of the partition through textiles. Both graduation projects, Arjunvir researched the Majnu KES, while Rashi designed participatory workshops around the Sanchi Fulkari.
Of fabric be designed such that it can inform people about the past? Can it narrate the story of its own history and that of its lost homeland? These are some questions that resulted in the inception of the Case Project. However, for practical purposes, in a hopelessly practical world, this journey started with a craft documentation in 2018, wherein we were supposed to work in pairs and research a textile craft of the country.
I, Rashi, along with my friend and batchmate Arjun, decided to study case as we both realized that there is very little that has been done when it comes to case as compared to other crafts of Punjab. Prior to this, there was just one document done on case, and there are hardly any books that talk about it. Another thing that we realized was that this document didn't mention Majnu case, something that we had found out about from other books and online sources and were very intrigued to find out more about, especially when Majnu case was the very element that made a connection between the case weaving traditions and the partition of the subcontinent.
But a time period of 9 weeks was not enough to cover all the various aspects, and hence we decided to take it ahead as our graduation projects. Academically, two different projects, partition being the thematic commonality. They were presented to people outside the institution as a joint effort under the name of the CASE project. Now we will both talk briefly about our individual academic projects.
Embroidered Memories talks about the need for tangible preservation of historical and cultural assets shared by both countries and promotes the preservation of material memory. The Fulgari panels narrate stories of migration along with the story of case. Listening to people's migration stories has given me some sort of answers to the questions I started this journey with. Questions on what memory is and how one perceives childhood memories played a significant role in understanding partition narratives. In addition to that, I specifically looked into the textiles that people carried with them while migrating and what those pieces mean to them. While introspecting, the most important question was how we would react given the current times if something like partition were to happen again. Sechi Fulkari was a figurative form of embroidery which documented the everyday lives of rural Punjab. Today, social media is the new age platform for the same. The subject being inherited memory gave me inspiration with every interaction, be it with interviewees or workshop participants. Starting this journey in Punjab and then coming back home to Mumbai due to the lockdown, language was a constant factor that kept me rooted with this project. A lot of Punjabi movies are still set in the context of partition and show how this event is engraved in the culture on both sides of the border.
Case, for me, has become more than just an object in the last 2 years. It's not just a piece of fabric anymore, rather, it's a story. A story that is untold, a story that is hidden in the storerooms of every Punjabi household, a story that has been forgotten. The aim of my project was to narrate this story to people and help it reach the same households where it lays hidden. I wanted to archive Majnu case before we lose it and its memory completely. While talking about narratives of partition and how, because of partition, we lost a textile craft that was once cherished by every Punjabi. In order to do that, I proposed an exhibition that would inform people about Khas as a textile craft, how it was affected due to the partition of India, and how, as I found out during my research, it is related to the charbags of Mughal architecture in terms of the visual language. Looking back, this project turned out to be a research heavy project because I was stuck in a closed space and all I could do was read. If not for the pandemic, I wonder if my project would have been more of a revival project than an archival project. Most people from our generation don't know what all happened during partition, and that is because partition is seen as an event of the past, something that happened long back and something that is not important anymore. But it is so important for us to study these things right now and learn from them. Learn from our own history so that such a thing doesn't happen again, so that we don't lose more syncretic cultures and traditions, so that we don't lose diversity, so that we don't lose love, and so that that love doesn't become hatred. This was an attempt at doing so through the medium of Khas and Fulkari, two textile traditions of a torn apart land.
Ashura by Jyotsna Ramesh, her animation film design graduation project told through a first-person perspective about a woman's life within the Brahminical patriarchy in urban India. The film questions the hypocritical standards women are held to from a very young age.
Hello, this is Jyotsna Ramesh. I'm here to present my project, Ashura, an animated work in progress short film, and the process behind its making. It is a personal point of view story based loosely on events from my own life and is a film that follows a young urban Indian girl from the time of her birth to her mid 20s and the various little and not so little ways she rebels against patriarchal structures, systems, and rules. As a film, the research was based on years of lived experience and is in some ways a cathartic rant born of feminist rage against the patriarchy and injustice. The film is limited in terms of the audience it is made for and also what it speaks of, limited to my personal experiences. I wanted to make a film that a younger version of me would have wanted, in fact, needed to see. A film that acts like a green signal for women my age and younger to come into themselves. A film that represented women who look like and behave like me. A lot of my work is deeply personal. I truly believe that the personal is political, and often it takes years of processing and sifting through to gain insights about our own pasts, to connect the dots and gain a sense of clarity. Therefore, looking in hindsight as a practice grants one a sense of freedom and the opportunity to put time and space between ourselves and our observations, and lets us re examine and reinterpret them. It involved confronting so many of my own biases and internalized propaganda, and acknowledging that I too was a product of the patriarchy and operated within it, and that informs my design choices and assumptions, be it the camera angles one picks, or why one chooses a particular brief and subject. And it also led me to questioning personal values and desires, who one aspires to be, and why. This process and story, despite being something I had deep conviction in, was extremely disconcerting and uncomfortable. When one still engages and lives within the same structures that one is criticizing, it is difficult to divorce oneself from the brainwashing and have faith in one's work, and harder still for it to not be influenced by the same. I was extremely anxious about being equated directly with the protagonist and being shamed personally as an extension. This discomfort I faced translated then to me incorporating intentionally scenes that make the audience sit with the same questions and sense of unease and confront their own biases. So much so that perhaps the film leaves little breathing room for them to interpret it in their own way.
Sinhora is Kasturi's animation film design graduation project. Inspired by her maternal grandparents' story, the film charts the journey of a Bihari marriage and narrates the parallels between the couple's first and last day together.
My learning through the years at NID has built and risen to the crescendo of the film that I and many others have given shape to Sinhora, a tale of remembrance, culture, love, and loss. This film has a familiar story and familiar characters, bound together with culture. It emphasizes the traditions that establish lifelong bonds and secure them, and the ones that aim towards helping one let go. Sinhura is a term for the vessel containing the sacred vermilion powder, sindoor, that Hindu brides are required to cherish throughout their lives. It remains a big part of the Bihari Hindu tradition even today. The sindoor is a symbol for the man in the marriage, and the sinhora traditionally goes with the husband's pair at his funeral. But this story aims to establish the woman and the man as equals in a marriage, using the same traditions and artifacts that tell us otherwise. Sinhura takes an old man on a journey of acceptance, as an old folk song takes him through a window of the past into a reality he wishes to avoid. The inspiration was drawn from my maternal grandparents. I lost my Nani in March of 2017, and one of the most profound memories I hold of a funeral is my Nanaji applying sindoor in her hair parting for one last time. Words of a poem he wrote about his wedding day had made their way into my mind. कंपित चुटकी में सिंदूर ले मांग में मैंने फेर दिया अज्ञात प्रभों की माया जान हृदय ने तुम्हें स्वीकार किया, which translates to, the vermilion in my shivering fingers I spread in the parting of your hair, and through the illusion of unknown gods, you, my heart, chose to embrace. These lines, accompanied with such powerful imagery, was the inspiration behind Sinhora. There were several dilemmas in the journey of making it. I struggled with separating myself from the narrative, but I was also adamant on telling the tale of just two people and their specific story, albeit with certain creative liberties. I was worried about reaffirming patriarchal norms through my story, but I tried to get rid of such thoughts, for this is where I was factoring in. I had to keep my opinions and views separate from the reality of my grandparents. I figured that I had to stay close enough to empathize, but far enough to be able to look objectively, and that was my Goldilocks zone throughout the production. I see this film through a different lens now that my grandfather is forgetting his memories and poems. It has become even more important to me to tell their story, and I hope I have captured and immortalized him and my Nani and the love and bond they shared through my film. Sinora has helped me peer into myself and re examine many things about the people I've known all my life, but may never know entirely.
Sharan Adka's graduation project, Identity Design for the Art Biennium, questions the notions of identity design beyond modernist paradigms in a context as diverse and pluralistic as India.
Hello, I am Sharan Adka, a recent design graduate from NID Ahmedabad, specializing in graphic design. Thank you for the opportunity to showcase my project here at Lines of Sight. My project is the identity design of the Art Biennale, which is a transdisciplinary festival centered around water and its co-agent, based in and around the city of Chandigarh for a span of 2 years. The festival needed an identity that could be strong and consistent, as well as fluid and dynamic for its various interventions. This project was done under the mentorship of Shivanalla Perumal and Juhi Vishnani at November Studio. The project began with the pretext that today's branding is blinded by the modernist need to make finite solutions. Quick and easy fixes, a logo, a grid, and some colors, and this completes the engagement with design. Making a basic toolkit for an entity like ARB would be a great disservice where there's a unique opportunity to make a growing, mutating identity. My design education, like many others in the world, derives itself from the post-war functionalism of Bauhaus. While different cultures had their own styles, the international styles spread to dominate every aspect of culture. Everyone got the box, no matter what the climate, culture, script, or context. Modernism's most famous slogan, less is more, is inherently fascist and promotes the idea of oneness. Jan Schihold, the inventor of the modern grid, later considered his views as too extreme and eventually renounced modernism. India, though inherently alien to this context, bought into this modernist dogma. Modern solutions rarely work for a country as diverse and plural as India. Nevertheless, the principles of modernism are still taught in design school throughout the world today. Strict rules and rigid grids are just too comfortable for designers to give up. In a way, it legitimizes and validates design and designers. No matter if it was developed 100 years ago in a completely different context, it has remained the default style of corporate communication worldwide. Through this project, I look whether we can move away from these grand narratives of modernism that look at design as a problem solver and take up a point of view of skepticism and criticism, effectively breaking the idea of a clean logo. Can we question whether these values hold true in a country like ours? Plural is an apt word to describe the Indian experience. It is about accepting a multitude of experiences and opinions and ways of life, and hence this is inherently democratic. Design puts emphasis on a logical design process, but there is no guarantee that if one follows it, that the end product will be good. Intuition and experience are often ignored in the process. The clients of ARB agreed with us on this and urged us to design contrary to design thinking and find an artistic solution to designing the identity. This is when we asked ourselves, can we not take the easy way to simplicity when functionality was in question? How can we create enough playroom to stay stimulated throughout the 2 years and flexible enough to produce under time pressure without having to deliver a simple design? A simple idea does not always warrant a simple expression. With ARB, We started with working on the ambience. The idea to interpret, as in the brief, water as a murky entity, taking inspiration from the science of water and expanding on it. Chandigarh also provides a unique juxtaposition of the modern and the plural, which eventually found its way into the identity. Designers are looked as and often tend to look themselves as problem solvers. I went through the savior complex for most of part of myself, thinking I can magically unravel years of tangled mess without a more critical way of looking at it. Only later did I understand that culture does not form in a vacuum, and design is only a small part of a much larger cultural space. Understanding the other things that occupy the space, whether it be music, architecture, fashion, film, caste, gender, or others, is imperative, and this gives rise to a pluralistic practice. So how can pluralism be interpreted in the case of art? Can the logo be brought down from its pedestal? Can typography, colors, imagery, iconography, and more come together in a more democratic manner? Can ideas come from beyond the traditional methods? Is it possible to resist the urge to make a template-based work and inculcate a content-driven approach to our practice? Are there ways to create consistency without monotony? And most importantly, can we relook at what visual design means in India, beyond the usual gimmicks done by brands, one that is informed by larger and diverse and contradictory ideologies of the country. The pandemic had defunct the project, but it was an important project for me nevertheless. With the pandemic, I got to learn to be more aware of myself and my experiences. The project was a stark contradiction to what I had learned through my time in design school. It took me time to reorient myself to new knowledge, and people rarely talk about how difficult it is to learn with a deadline. Though retrospectively, people look at these moments favorably. Learning is uncomfortable, but one must do it nevertheless with a plural mindset. Thank you.
Sreelakshmi M's film Survival of a Memory explores a future where sunlight is a luxury and artificial light floods our eyes, alongside the possibility where space, time, and memory can be intrinsically connected.
Hi, I'm Sreelakshmi M, and I'm here to talk about my project Survival of a Memory. I made this project as a part of my open elective non-standard time. The objective of the elective was to come up with alternative timekeepers for a speculative future. Timekeepers in the conventional sense would be a clock or a watch or a calendar. So the initial step of the process was to speculate what the future world might look like. I created a future wheel for a summer in 2050, wherein I panned out the factors that would be influenced and its effects. However, it became clear that I needed to contextualize the speculative future in terms of our geographical region. So, using our past and present conditions as a reference, I imagined that the cramped up spaces such as that of Dharavi or coffin houses in Hong Kong would become the norm throughout. Once the space got defined, it soon dawned on me how sunlight would be the next factor to consider in our perception of time. The Sun Temple is a magnificent example of how medieval civilization used sun's movement to understand and accordingly allocate time for the day. Now it is at this juncture that I conducted an experiment where I removed clocks from my room and spent some hours without natural sunlight. Soon, as if instinctively, my brain started craving for a clock to establish order. A sense of lethargy overcame my senses, and I was unable to think actively. I read more about it and found out there was a similar experiment done by NASA with an interior designer named Stefania Follini in 1989, wherein Follini voluntarily isolated herself in an underground cave in New Mexico and spent 130 days in isolation to understand the circadian rhythm of our bodies. It was clear that space and sunlight were two important factors for making a timekeeper in this world. But there was one factor that I was overlooking completely: memory. I realized that time is nothing if it isn't remembered. Now, this is where the film entirely jumps into fiction. It loosely interprets the process of photography by substituting the reel's ability to be exposed as an imprint of time. Thus, the film reel became my timekeeper. One's time then revolves around the duration between the memory fading away and memory being revived due to sunlight. We're trying to keep a memory alive by passing.
I think we're having a tech issue.
Let's move to the next.
The floor is now open for a roundtable discussion between today's speakers. I welcome back Sarita, our guest speaker, and Rishi as faculty interlocutor for the roundtable to share their thoughts, observations, and questions along with the student presenters.
Thank you, Abhirami. So thank you so much, Sarita, for the wonderful presentation. And with your presentation as well as the student presentations, I was just jotting down a few keywords. So perhaps, I'll pepper the conversation with these keywords, and then, you can initiate a certain discussion, you can respond to that. So I think one of the key things is the acknowledgement of the past. You begin by first acknowledging certain aspects, as Jyotsna also made a point, through her film, that acknowledging the past, acknowledging the body, acknowledging the lived experiences is so crucial in beginning to make sense of our present. So acknowledging the past is one of the key aspects that I feel we need to talk about a tad bit. And then, of course, memory and what role memory plays in making us make any sense of our present in context of our past. So the keywords are basically memory, and the third aspect that I'll introduce here is how important is nostalgia, and can we separate nostalgia from meaning making from the past?
Should I jump in, or would a student join in?
Yeah, I mean, its floor is open.
No, but let's see if the students sort of have something to say, and then I'll join in. No, okay. So I thanks for that, Rishi. I feel I think this question of nostalgia is something that that the past is so intrinsically linked with, and there is a sense also at one end of us sort of shying away from things that are to do with nostalgia because of its sort of soft touchy-feely aspect of it, and at the same time there is the natural inclination that the past sort of does engender feelings of nostalgia, whether it is pleasant, unpleasant, whatever else it could be. And I think as sort of people who intervene in these spaces or act as interpreters, the question I have, and I've often thought about, is how does one decide on the tone of one's interpretation? What is that sort of quality? Because I think that eventually adds to whatever else content we might add to. So what is the sort of tone that one takes? Is it sort of deeply entrenched in nostalgia, or is it not? In my opinion, it could sort of swing either way, and taking off from something like not maybe acting as sort of distant sort of viewers, or sort of looking at the sort of potential audiences, one could sort of tailor it this way or that. And I felt Kashi's project, Kasturi's project, which sort of looks at the idea of sort of memory, does build on nostalgia, and something like that is something that is supposed to sort of tug at one's heartstrings, so to speak. Something like the Fulkari and the Keshi project could be something that sort of sits either way in between these two spaces of being a little distance and away, and yet can still be steeped in nostalgia and feeling.
Right. And connected to that, Arjunvir in his description, said, what can be learned from the past? So if I were to ask the panelists, what are the tangible and intangible aspects that can be learned from the past? Is it always intangible, or can materiality or, aspects of certain tangible values can be derived from the past, or is it always intangible? And, if you may want to further add to that.
If I can jump in.
Yes.
I just wanted to respond to what Sarita said and what you said earlier, Rishi, of how there is that love-hate relationship with the past and nostalgia. And I think I have an observation of, even when things are extremely traumatic, as with, say, Arjun and Rashi's project with partition, or even in our own personal lives, there is a tendency to look at it with nostalgia, because what the one thing the past offers that the present never can, or the future never can, is a sense of surety and certainty. So even if it is disastrous, we look towards it because it's at least charted out, and one can put a certain level of distance and say that this is something that I know how to deal with because it's already happened. And that documentation, I feel, is why we also then tend to look towards the past so much to chart out, or rather better prepare for the future. It's almost like a coping mechanism.
So I think, yes, go ahead, Sarita.
That's a very interesting statement, Jyotsna, and something that I actually wanted to add to when watching your film and your project, actually. There is, I don't know, I'm from Kerala, and in Kathakali we have a scene when if any of you sort of watch Kathakali, there's a scene where during the war, in rather gory details, the innards of Dushasana are sort of taken out, and the blood that comes out of it is then used to tie Draupadi's hair, because she swore that she would never tie her hair until the death of Dushasana. Now in Kathakali, that is it is represented in the most vivid manner, and I do believe that it helps the audience to deal with their baser emotions, the baser emotions that we often shrug, but the fact is, as humans, we do have baser emotions. And I think when we interpret aspects from the past or from any sort of cultural sort of myth and things like that, when we use forms such as the one that I sort of described, it allows us to come to terms or to accept some of the baser emotions that we shut off. And similarly, in the past, there's a lot of sort of things that you don't want to confront. But whenever we are able to confront it in a manner, it allows some sort of healing, I believe, in the way that I imagine Draupadi healed.
So I think in a way, we are also learning ways of life from the past. How people lived, what were their challenges, what were their privileges, and perhaps what were their vulnerabilities. And, we try to contextualize that in our present. So my question is it important for us to, in some ways, declutch ourselves from the popular culture, the contemporary popular culture, in order to make sense of the past? Or can the two go side by side?
I think.
If I may add to that, respond to that.
Yes.
I feel like the idea of present itself is a lot like devised from our past, right? I mean, whatever actions that we're doing today, it somewhere or another has a sort of thread or a sort of connection going into the past. So to entirely declutch itself from the past would be like honestly like a dishonest sort of or sort of a take to what is happening in the present right now. It's almost as if um, you're ignoring the sort of the growth or the sort of stories or the sort of cultures that you have come from. So to declutch yourself from the past is almost it's inhumane almost. It's not possible sometimes, because declutching in that sense would be like I feel like it would be sort of running away from the sort of journey that one has had. So even when it like comes to something like partition, like the current scenario and like everything that is happening right now, to detach yourself from that would be to almost sort of erase the sort of history that we've had, and to erase somebody's history is to almost question their existence today. So the idea of declutching, then I feel like it's a bit of a problem. So, and I don't think it's possible. Yeah.
And do we need to be careful to not commodify the past? Because many a times, knowingly or unknowingly, we end up doing that. We commodify things in a certain context. We also fetishize things in a certain context. And I don't know if that really helps. So any comments?
I'm going to wait for some students to answer that and then jump in.
See, also, I don't know if you guys are noticing that many organizations are latching onto, this new catchphrase, archives. Everyone wants to do their research. They want to talk about, all the underprivileged communities, people, from the past that we don't know about. But ultimately, it's a business model. So how do we ensure that, we are looking at it with a certain compassion, with a certain understanding, and not just creating another commodity using these objects or memories or ways of life from the past? Or is it important at all?
I'm just
yes,
answering to that. Yeah, sure. So I think this also comes into play when we say stuff like that we are ignoring Indian design and stuff, and always people like to show examples of pre-digital graphic design or visual design work and just kind of bring it back, right? And they look at it as sort of trend words like retro, and if it's history enough, then it's called tradition. But when they bring stuff back like this, it's almost as if it's just for the commodity sake and just to, as the same word that you guys used earlier, nostalgia. You're trying to bring back something because it's certainty of how it exactly plays out, and that is why you bring it back to the front. But I think when we actually are looking at it more critically, that we should probably relook at that, and we're talking about bringing Indian design back or questioning what is Indian design. It needs to look at examples and reinterpret in today's context, and that is how I think we could see in the future, rather than just picking up motifs or similarities and just change elements in it. I think that's where using these elements in a modern day context is when you can actually break the commodifying of it, and it's not just a gimmick that brands or anyone does for that matter.
If I may jump in quickly, though, I do feel though in a capitalist society that we do operate in, to a certain degree, it's also a little naive to think that yes, the fetishization of the past is something to beware of. But I also think that when we're increasingly so driven to find content and constantly engage and constantly find new narratives, right? Why is the fringe so popular? Why are marginalized voices popular? Because we already heard what the mainstream has to say. So now capitalist society must exploit what the fringe has to say because it's new and it's fresh. And I don't entirely know if it's possible to protect ourselves from that, or protect that trend, or like stop it from happening. I feel like maybe the only way to really do that is really radical or slow but radical change, where people from those communities themselves get to tell their stories, and it's not the mainstream that's appropriating it. But it's a tricky line to cross and walk.
Okay.
Yeah, I think I think she encapsulated it pretty well. Like in the sense that things are going to like be in trend. Sometimes it's going to be futuristic design. Sometimes it's going to be like going back to the retro style. So somewhere or another, it's I mean the entire idea of commodification itself, like she just mentioned, how the capitalist structure is just it's in such a way that whatever people want, I mean, it's going to be commodified in that way. So it's like a trend. Sometimes your bell-bottom jeans are in trend. Sometimes the other like the other straight jeans or whatever, like they are in trend. So it's a thing that keeps coming and going on.
I guess as an informed designer or a filmmaker, artist, perhaps the roles of the authors, creators of the present become even more responsible. That how you deal with this equation. And to what extent you dole it out, even if it is expected by an audience.
I think what Jyotsna is saying, there are two things really here. One is the use of the past, the either making it into a commodity or a fetish. Two is the way in which the past should be allowed to be told by, say, the marginalized community on their own, rather than by someone who leads it from above. In the first case, I think what's critical is, if one is using the past, one should do it deliberately and not do it in a manner that is sort of innocent. And I'm sort of borrowing what Umberto Eco talks about. When you borrow from the past, do it with deliberate irony, do it with sort of deliberate have a take on it. Don't do it in a way that it is seen as an appropriation in an innocent manner. When it is an appropriation, I think, is when it becomes problematic, because then you are making use of it. You're not adding a sort of a layer of interpretation. You're sort of directly just plonking it in a modern situation, possibly in a place that it should not be. But if you're doing it in a sense as a take, as a sort of with irony, the way in which actually postmodernism does. Postmodernism actually borrows from the past, and it does it in a deliberate way. And in the same way, within the sort of postmodern fold, you're also looking at allowing for these multiple voices to speak. So I think this move away, that Sharan's also sort of talking about, moving away from the sort of the myth of modernism into a space which allows both for multiple voices and to use the past with a sort of a deliberate, conscious, ironical take, is the way forward. That's my opinion.
Unfortunately, due to time constraints, we have to close the roundtable session now. To take this conversation further, we invite you to continue interacting and asking questions by joining the Google Meet link that has been posted in the chat. I now invite Praveen Nahar, Director of NIT, to say a few words.
So does that mean we are ending this session and joining on Google?
Yes.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Rishi. And Sarita, nice to see you. Nice to hear. I was sorry, I was in and out of my work and I was hearing, but I think I could go through most of your presentation. It was very nice to, understand and see your journey. And I think I understand that it's a nice conversation. But I think my kudos to all the team. I think this whole series has been a really, very thought-provoking and, an important initiative. I think we all have initiated since last couple of years, but this year it is also with all this series of webinars and this dialogues and conversations. And it's really important that every year, throughout the year, actually, we should go through this kind of reflections and bring different disciplines and different years of students, with the freshers to students who are graduating, and also professionals, our own graduates and other experts together. And I really appreciate the fact that everybody really contributed. The team has really worked in the back end to make sure that everybody is on toes to make this happen, and people could prepare and present. Only slight disappointment, but I don't think that is so much important. I think for any new initiative to mobilize people to attend and come, I think it's a bit of a challenge, and there's too much of digital exposure we have, and people attending classes and this and that. So it's maybe difficult to navigate or keep track of a lot of this. But I think I understand that this is also going to be a archive for forever, and I think people can go back and refer. And so I can see there's a lot of landmark discussions, people inspired, for their lifetime, for many, conversations and exposure. People could look into each other's work and follow on interesting conversations. There was very personal expressions of ideas and thoughts and reflections, which could be seen very, very prominently through the entire process. Again, my congratulations to everyone who participated, curated, spoke in the conference, and also attended through this thing. I personally really enjoyed this series, and I hope that this format itself, I think, inspires all of us, to continue to build this kind of formats for other events and other things we do throughout the year, whether it is Baatein or any of the conversations. It's very important that there are all points of view are, brought in to a platform, and we all kind of inspire each other. So great. Thanks. I think this is one of the last event we had for convocation and sending off our new batch. And I still carry this 41st convocation banner in my office. So great. Over to you all, Kanishka and group.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, team. Thank you, Sarita. Thanks, Rishi. It would be lovely to carry on the conversation for another 15 minutes. Do join the Google Meet link. I think there are a lot of interesting, lines of thought that were emerging. So, and throughout the year as well. Bye-bye.
Oh, you have to run to another. This room is going to be used by another group.
That's right.
And you have this Zoom connection, which you are going to use for your next meeting. Come on.
The archives conversation carries on with the last in the series of EAT in India. So those of you who are interested,
I find it a bit disruptive, but that's okay.
We have Yu Nakai from Japan who's joining us today, and that's why